Today we are going to be speaking about the different ideologies that led to a clash between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And specifically, we're going to talk about how these differences led to the first conflict of the Cold War years. While you're listening, I'd like you to focus on how and why did the Cold War begin, and what major conflicts or confrontations involved the United States, as well as how did Cold War tensions cause divisiveness at home. After the defeat of Germany and Japan in World War II, the U.S. entered into a long struggle with the Soviet Union. This struggle became known as the Cold War. The U.S. and the USSR had been allies during World War II, but after the war, their disagreements grew. This era was known as the Cold War because there had been political tension between the two countries, but never open warfare. Slowly, these differences grew into conflict. Let's take a closer look at the major differences that existed between the United States and the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War years. One of the major differences between the United States and the Soviet Union was their beliefs on government and what a government should provide for their citizens and how a government should be run. The United States practiced democracy, which is a government that focuses on liberty and freedom of citizens. It stresses individualism, where each citizen can be unique and pursue their own dreams and goals. It also provides personal resources where individuals can have ownership of their own goods and their own resources. The Soviet Union practiced a government that focuses on dictatorship. In this type of government, they focus on equality and commonality, meaning that all people are going to be treated similar rather than focusing on their uniqueness or their individualism. And the idea behind their government is that all resources should be shared equally amongst the citizens. Unfortunately, they weren't always shared equally, and we'll be talking about that in a few moments. Another major difference between the two superpowers were how they tried to influence other countries throughout the Cold War. The United States developed a policy called the Marshall Plan, where they worked to rebuild Europe, promote trade, democracy, and they were seeking to prevent future wars. The Soviet Union, instead of offering financial aid, they would send their military to push communism and to push their beliefs on other countries. Another very big difference between these two countries were their ideologies and their beliefs. The United States worked towards a system of capitalism, which is an economy where industry and farms are privately owned by citizens and individuals. The Soviet Union practiced communism, which is an economy where the government owns industry and owns farms, so the government has control over pretty much every aspect of business and the economy. These two concepts can be pretty difficult to understand and differentiate, so I'm going to show you a real quick brain pop to make this simpler on what communism actually is and what it's supposed to look like and how it actually might appear when practiced in places like the Soviet Union during the Cold War.
Hurry! What? I can't lift that thing. Dear Tim and Moby, I've been reading about communism. Can you explain it? From Quincy. You've probably heard about communism in terms of other countries' governments. Communism is an economic system where wealth is distributed evenly to everybody. It's sort of the opposite of capitalism, where everybody competes to make money. In a pure communist society, there would be no private property, and everybody would be equal in wealth and social status. So a coal miner would make the same wage as, say, a banker. Well, that's the theory behind communism. The reality is that communist countries tend to be undemocratic, concentrating power in the hands of very few people, or even one dictator. So most communist societies have ended up benefiting the few at the expense of the majority. Communist states like Cuba and North Korea are examples of those tendencies. Well, we can try to understand communism by going back to its beginnings. Communism was the creation of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, two German philosophers. In the late 19th century, they published a short political pamphlet called the Communist Manifesto. Marx and Engels thought that capitalism had created a society of unequal classes, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The proletariat is the working class, and it makes up the majority of society. The bourgeoisie, or bourgeois, are the wealthier class. They're the owners of capital, stuff like factories, buildings, property, and just plain money. Okay, just stay with me. According to Marx and Engels, capitalism exploits the proletariat, making people work long hours at meaningless jobs for not enough money. Meanwhile, the bourgeoisie gets all the rewards of their hard work. The manifesto predicted that around the world the proletariat would revolt against the bourgeoisie. They would take over the factories and the governments, and eventually set up a new society where everyone's work would be valued equally. Yeah, that's what the workers back then thought too. By the early 20th century, communism had become very popular. Some governments were being replaced with communist ones, first in Russia, then China. But in both of these countries, the communist leaders quickly established totalitarian governments, putting most of the power in the hand of a single dictator. Well, it's not that communists are bad people, but communist societies have a centralized economy, meaning just about everything is controlled by the government. What that does is it puts a ton of power into very few people's hands. Unfortunately, history has shown that once people get power, they like to keep it. Oh, yeah, that's the other thing. Most communist countries haven't had very successful economies. The Soviet Union, which included communist Russia and several nearby countries, dissolved in the early 1990s. And China has begun to switch back to a market economy, capitalism. Cuba and North Korea, which have remained communist for many decades now, both rely on donations from other countries to survive. Well, there are lots of reasons why their economies are struggling. Some say communism has a built-in problem. No matter how hard you work, you still get the same pay. So there's a lot less of a reason for people to put in their best effort. Well, it would be wrong to say that communism has been proven a complete mistake. Lots of governments, like those in Europe, have different degrees of socialism, a sort of cross between capitalism and communism. In these countries, people have private property, but the government provides for basic needs, like housing and health care. Hey, can you finish moving this dresser now? How about you do it for the greater glory of my room? Oh, okay, and $1.
So as you can see, the theory behind communism is pretty convincing that if it's run appropriately and as pure communists, they would be taking care of their citizens and providing equal opportunities for all. However, what ends up happening is when power is given to the wrong hands or falls into the wrong hands, usually it ends up as totalitarianism, where these dictators have absolute control and often deny individual freedoms to their citizens, rather than providing for all citizens equally. So that's where these differences in ideologies played a huge part in the Cold War. Another major difference was just politics. The United States has a constitutional democracy where we practice majority rules. Whatever most people want or whatever most people choose and support, that's the law or the policy that we will follow. We do this by voting, and our Constitution guarantees specific rights and freedoms to all citizens, and it's protected under the Constitution. The Soviet Union during the Cold War was practicing totalitarianism, where power is concentrated in one party, a group of people, or just one individual. In this case, it started off with Joseph Stalin. And there's no individual rights because that leader has total power, absolute power, and whatever they say goes. So it's very easy for them to deny citizens their rights and freedoms. Lastly, a major difference was the different countries that both of these superpowers had supported throughout major conflicts of the Cold War years. So the first very difficult decision and compromise that they had to come up with was what to do with Germany following World War II. If you remember, when they divided up Germany, the United States, along with France and Great Britain, supported West Germany and set up a democratic state, while the Soviet Union controlled East Germany and set up a communist state there. In a few minutes, we'll be learning about the Korean War, in which case the United States supported South Korea and the Soviet Union supported North Korea. And then a couple decades later, the Vietnam War takes place, and again the United States supports South Vietnam and the Soviet Union will support North Vietnam. So in the Korean and Vietnam Wars, they made it easy on us. The South had always been the democratic nation while the North had practiced communism. So US in the South, Soviet Union in the North. Because of these differences, the United States signed an agreement with Western European nations where they formed an alliance that said an armed attack against one member nation would be considered an attack against all of the member nations. So if you take a look here, all of the nations in blue signed this agreement or this alliance. The agreement was called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or, much simpler, NATO. So the U.S. and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization decided to work together to stop the spread of communism. In response to this, the Soviet Union set up their own alliance, which was known as the Warsaw Pact, and that was made up mostly of many Eastern European countries that had been very influenced by communism throughout this time of history. So we have NATO and the Warsaw Pact. The communist countries separated themselves from the rest of Europe through secrecy and censorship. In a very famous speech, Winston Churchill, if you remember, he is the leader in Great Britain, described the invisible separation as an iron curtain that had descended upon Europe. He believed that this was a permanent divide that would be very difficult to get rid of between the two parts of the world, and specifically the two different sides of Europe. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization believed in a thing called the domino theory, and it's an idea that if one country is taken over by a communist neighbor, then all the nearby nations would also be taken over one after the other. So kind of like if you pile up or if you line up a whole set of dominoes, when one falls, the rest will fall. Let's take a look at a quick video in case you haven't seen dominoes before. Be sure to check out the second video to find out how the North Atlantic Treaty Organization fought against the domino theory, and also to fill out the rest of your notes on ideologies and conflict.